Dungeon Reaper. A light novel by Bloodmoss. Chapter 17. The Wait at the Threshold. Cain sat in the dim stillness of his small apartment, tucked away at the back of the dojo. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and faint incense, mingling with the metallic tang of sweat on his skin. Shadows stretched long across the walls, broken only by the soft glow of a single lamp flickering on the low table beside him. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, staring at the Kuzarigama, its blade catching the pale light. The chain had fallen to the floor. Then it started. That low hum. A vibration deep in his gut that slowly spread through his chest, rising until it thrummed in his ears. Familiar now, but no less unsettling. The in-between was calling. Cain let out a slow breath. No use resisting. The pull intensified and the apartment blurred at the edges. Shadows stretched, deepened, until they swallowed the room whole. The floor seemed to fall away beneath him, and in the next breath, he was standing in the familiar haze of the Caffè Afterlife. The soft murmur of conversation and the clink of glassware filled the air. The cafe was as it always was, half-lit, half-real, a place that seemed to exist on the edge of memory. The walls stretched too far and not far enough, lined with books that no one read and windows that showed nothing at all. Maria's voice sliced through the haze. Yikes. You look like roadkill, Grim. She lounged in her usual booth, legs kicked up, polishing off the last drop of her lukewarm, watered-down coffee. The only unfortunate drink served in what Cain now considered Reaper HQ. Cain dragged himself toward the counter, every step heavier than the last, exhaustion sinking deep into his bones. His limbs ached with that familiar, grinding soreness, the kind that burrowed into the joints and refused to leave. He barely mustered the energy to smirk. Glad to know you all miss me, he muttered, voice rougher than usual. Tobias only glanced up from his teacup for a moment, the muddy brown liquid swirling slowly as if reflecting his mood. More like roadkill that got hit twice, he replied flatly, taking a delicate sip. Maria snorted from her booth, casually twirling her now empty cup. Missed you? No. But we did place bets on when you dropped dead from overtraining. Her grin widened. I was betting on yesterday. Cain's eyes shifted to the quiet figure hunched over a notebook in the corner. And you're as charming as ever, oh great tactician, Cain quipped, voice dripping with sarcasm. Edgar didn't look up. His pen scratched steadily across the page, the faintest twitch of an eyebrow the only sign he'd even heard Cain. The air suddenly changed. It wasn't just colder, it was heavier, denser, like the atmosphere itself recognized authority when it entered the room. Cain straightened instinctively, a reflexive tension in his spine. Shaniqua's heels clicked sharply against the warped floorboards as she emerged from the threshold of the cafe, her posture as rigid and precise as a drawn blade. She wasn't alone. Beside her, a pale figure stumbled forward. The newcomer's wide, bloodshot eyes darted in every direction, scanning the surreal haze of the Caffè Afterlife as though expecting the walls themselves to close in. Sweat clung to his skin, soaking dark strands of hair that clung to his forehead. His breath came in shallow, ragged gasps, every exhale shuddering like his lungs were struggling to work. Everyone, meet Nathaniel Greaves. Shaniqua's voice was smooth, even, but carried that edge of finality that allowed no room for question. Nathaniel's lips trembled, his throat bobbing as he swallowed hard. His eyes, wide and glassy, flicked between them all. Where am I? He whispered, as if saying it louder might make the answer worse. Cain knew that look, the wide, hollow eyes, the shallow, uneven breaths. The kind of fear that didn't let go. He exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders to ease the weight in them. You're dead, Cain said, his voice quieter than usual, with only a thin edge of sarcasm. This is the in-between. Think of it as the waiting room before whatever's next. He gestured vaguely to the odd, shifting space around them. And this place? He gave the counter a light tap, less forceful than before. Welcome to Caffè Afterlife. Coffee's terrible. Company's worse. Nathaniel's face drained of what little color it had, his breath catching in his throat. Cain, Shaniqua's voice sharpened, like a warning shot. Cain's brows lifted slightly, hands raising in a slow, placating gesture. Hey, I'm not wrong. Just giving him the basics. His tone softened slightly, but his eyes didn't leave Nathaniel. Nathaniel wasn't hearing him. His arms folded tightly across his chest, gripping as if to hold himself together. I remember now, Nathaniel's voice cracked, barely above a whisper. It was supposed to be an easy errand run. Simple. We've done dozens of them. But this, it felt wrong from the start. The air was heavy, like breathing through wet cloth. And then someone else came. Fast. Too fast. His eyes darted, unfocused, trapped in the memory. Something hit me. Maybe poison. I don't know. I couldn't move. Just stuck there, watching them die. One by one. And I couldn't even scream. He trembled violently now, his next words barely escaping. Then hands. Cold hands. They dragged me into the dark. I never saw who. Just the dark. The room thickened with silence. Maria shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her smirk long gone. Even Tobias's usual disinterest faltered, his eyes narrowing slightly. Cain stared for a long moment, his expression hardening. Yeah, he murmured, voice low. I know that feeling. Paralyzed. Helpless. Like your own body turned against you. Nathaniel blinked, swallowing hard, caught in the gravity of Cain's words. Shaniqua moved then, her heels clicking sharply against the floor as she crossed to Nathaniel. Her hand settled firmly on his shoulder, not gently, but grounding. That's enough. Her voice brooked no argument. Her eyes, cold and sharp, flicked briefly to Cain, narrowing. We'll discuss what's happening in private, Nathaniel. You need time to process this before anything else. Her grip on his shoulder tightened slightly. Come. The door to the back creaked open and shut behind them, the final click sealing the room in a tense, heavy silence. Maria let out a low whistle, leaning back in her seat. You really know how to roll out the welcome mat, Grim. Cain rubbed a hand down his face, letting out a slow breath. Better he hears it straight than sugar-coated. Tobias raised an eyebrow over his teacup. Or maybe your overtraining's frying your social skills. Maria leaned in, her smirk fading into something sharper. Seriously, though. That kid looked all kinds of messed up. Not everyone takes it as well as you did. Cain stared at the spot where Nathaniel had stood, the tension in his shoulders tightening. Yeah, well, I wasn't born for this gig. His eyes darkened as he leaned forward on the counter. But I definitely died for it. That earned a low chuckle from Maria, and even Tobias's smirk twitched upward. Cain turned his head slightly, casting a glance toward Edgar. What about you? How'd you take it when you kicked it? Tobias snorted. Edgar? No clue. He was here before either of us. Maria shrugged. Yeah, never asked. Kinda assumed he's always been here, lurking in corners. Edgar slowly looked up from his notebook, his pen pausing mid-sentence. His eyes were steady, flat. I took it like I take everything. He closed the notebook with a quiet snap. Another move in the game. Cain gave a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. Figures. Before anyone could say more, the back door creaked open. Shaniqua stepped out, adjusting the cuffs of her blazer with deliberate precision. He's adjusting, she said flatly, as if the word covered the storm brewing in that back room. He's piecing together his new mortal coil. Cain tilted his head. Adjusting, huh? Seems like a generous way to put it. Shaniqua's sharp eyes cut toward him, but she didn't take the bait. Instead, she straightened, her tone shifting to something cooler and more official. Oh, and Cain, she began, casually brushing invisible lint from her sleeve. Congratulations. You're nearing Class D. Cain blinked. Wait, seriously? Tobias smirked, setting his teacup down with a soft clink. Surprised my training actually worked? Shaniqua didn't wait for his answer. Which brings me to your next assignment. You'll be mentoring the rookie. Cain's stomach dropped. Wait, what? And you'll be shadowing Blackthorn Vanguard. Cain opened his mouth, then paused. Blackthorn, that's. A new Class E guild, Shaniqua finished smoothly. Just got on the books. Nathaniel's paperwork is already approved, which is why you'll be mentoring him. Suddenly, a cold chill ran through him. Cain's breath caught, his grip on the counter tightening as an unsettling sensation crawled beneath his skin, like icy fingers trailing along his spine. Then the images came. Flickering, uninvited, yet painfully vivid. A quiet dojo bathed in the soft glow of evening light. The scent of aged wood and old incense hanging in the air. Tatami mats worn smooth by countless steps. Outside, crimson leaves drifted lazily from towering trees, carried on a cool autumn breeze. Step. The soft, deliberate footfalls of a child echoed in the stillness, a boy moving through practiced forms, his breathing steady but uncertain. His small hands gripped a wooden staff, too large for him but balanced all the same. And then a voice. Old, steady, and worn like weathered stone. Balance isn't stillness, boy. It's knowing where to step before the ground shifts beneath you. The child paused, eyes narrowing in concentration. He adjusted his stance. The staff moved more smoothly this time. Yes, grandfather. Cain could feel the boy's focus. The weight of the staff in his own hands. The cool air against his skin. But it wasn't his. It wasn't his memory. Yet it clung to him, woven into his mind like thread through fabric. Hoshizawa. Cain's chest tightened. This memory didn't belong to him. But it was his now, tangled in with his own past, as inseparable as flesh from bone. Cain. Shaniqua's voice cut through the haze, sharp and commanding. Cain blinked, his vision snapping back to the dim glow of the Caffè Afterlife. His breath was shallow, chest rising and falling in quick, uneven beats. Her eyes narrowed. I don't repeat myself. Cain swallowed hard, grounding himself. Right. Mentor the rookie. Got it. Shaniqua's smirk was razor-thin. Deal with it. But even as the room settled, Cain couldn't shake the weight of that memory. Hoshizawa's memory settling uneasily beside his own. Maria let out a relieved sigh, leaning back with a grin. Finally, we can stop running garbage tier dungeon crawls and get back to real work. Tobias nodded, looking far too pleased. About time. Cain cleared his head, finally letting the memories go. He let out a strained laugh. I think I'm a bit underqualified for this. Shaniqua's gaze hardened. That's how you learn. Just beyond the warped threshold of Caffè Afterlife, Hoshizawa stood motionless, his figure half swallowed by the swirling haze that bled from the building's fractured edges. The air around him felt dense and unnatural, as though the atmosphere itself was trying to push him back. It scraped against his skin like static, leaving behind a crawling sensation that should have unsettled him. But it didn't. His sharp eyes narrowed, focusing on the muffled voices bleeding through the distorted walls. Words slipped past the veil, dead, reaper, in between, spoken casually, as if death were nothing more than an inconvenience. The conversation twisted through the air like smoke, curling into his ears and rooting deep in his mind. They're dead? The thought lodged in his chest, heavy and cold, but it wasn't fear that took hold. It was sharper than that, something far more dangerous. The pressure in the air built around him, coiling tight like a spring. Every instinct told him to step back, to retreat from whatever ancient force pulsed just beyond the doorway. The very walls of the place seemed to reject him, as though this world was not meant for men like him. And yet, he didn't move. Instead, he flexed his fingers slowly, lifting his hands before him with deliberate care. What had been a faint wisp of gray mist before was now something far more vivid, thicker, darker tendrils of smoke coiling up from his palms. They twisted lazily into the air, but they didn't drift away. They lingered. Hoshizawa watched, transfixed, as the smoke began to move with unsettling purpose. The tendrils didn't explore the space around him or reach outward into the strange world pressing against him. No, they turned inward, curling back toward him, toward their source. Like living things, they crept along his wrists and slithered up his forearms, spiraling with curious grace. One delicate wisp reached higher, hesitating in the air before brushing lightly against his jawline. Another coiled upward to caress his cheekbone, the touch cold but strangely familiar. They weren't lashing out. They weren't hunting. They were studying him. Hoshizawa's eyes narrowed as he followed their movements, his breath slow and steady. The tendrils moved as though they recognized him, not as a master or a threat, but as something connected. His expression tightened, but he did not flinch. It's not Cain's aura anymore. No, this was his now. Woven into him, fused with the very breath in his lungs and the blood in his veins. The darkness didn't seek to consume him, it clung to him, curious and alive. And yet, it was still wild, unrefined. But that could change. If these shadows could be shaped, honed like steel, then strength would no longer be bound by flesh. His disciplined body was merely the vessel. This was the tool that could reshape the world. The corner of Hoshizawa's mouth lifted slightly, more thought than smile. Yes, but first, I need to understand. Lowering his hands slowly, the tendrils drifted back, coiling lazily around his wrists like docile serpents. They faded gradually, but the sensation of their touch remained, ghosting along his skin. Hoshizawa's hands slowly lowered, the lingering sensation of the tendrils still ghosting along his skin. The air ahead pulsed with that same unsettling pressure, heavier now, as if the very threshold of the Caffè Afterlife recognized him for what he was and rejected him. He stared at the doorway, its warped frame flickering at the edges like a mirage. The voices inside drifted to him, muffled and distant, yet sharp enough to stir the unease curling in his chest. No, he wasn't ready. Not yet. They wouldn't accept him, not as he was now. The power threading through his veins was still raw, unstable. The dark aura twisting around him wasn't something he controlled, it merely tolerated him. He needed more. More time to understand this bond. More time to make this connection stable. More time inside Cain's mind. His eyes narrowed, studying the flickering threshold with cold calculation. Barging in now would be reckless. Premature. The power in this place wasn't meant to be taken, it had to be earned, shaped, folded into something useful. So he remained where he was, feet firmly planted, letting the strange air of the in-between curl and press against him like a test he hadn't passed yet. Not yet. But soon.